My name is Alexander Kingsley, and for the past decade, I built my life around art, not just as a collector or a curator, but as a creator of something bigger, a legacy. Kingsley Modern wasn't just a gallery, it was a symbol of everything I had worked for. Every artist I discovered, every exhibition I curated, every deal I made, it was all a reflection of my vision. And for years I believed I wasn't building it alone. I believed in my wife, Emily, the woman who had stood beside me through it all. The woman I trusted more than anyone. But trust is a dangerous thing. I didn't see the betrayal coming, not at first. The late nights, the quiet conversations, the small, careful lies. I ignored the signs, convinced myself I was imagining things, until the truth became impossible to deny. She wasn't just unfaithful. She was dismantling everything I had built, piece by piece, preparing to take it all and leave me with nothing. She thought I wouldn't notice. She thought I wouldn't fight back. That was her first mistake. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, it really helps. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. Alexander Kingsley had built his life around art, curating not just exhibitions, but experiences. His gallery, Kingsley Modern, was more than a business. It was his identity. Every brushstroke, every sculpture, every piece displayed within those walls was an extension of his soul. He had dedicated years to transforming it into a cornerstone of the city's art scene. People respected him. They sought his opinion, his connections, his taste. And at the heart of it all was Emily, his wife, his partner, his muse. She had been with him from the beginning, through the struggle of opening the gallery, through nights spent arguing over acquisitions, through the long years of carving a niche in an industry that chewed up and spat out dreamers. She had an eye for talent, a keen sense for what would sell. Together, they were an unstoppable force, or at least that was what Alexander had believed. Lately, something had changed. It started subtly. A shift in her habits, a certain guardedness in her manner. She used to share everything with him, but now she hesitated before answering his questions. Her phone, which once sat openly on their kitchen counter, was now always face down, always silenced. She had started coming home later than usual, her explanations vague. He told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining things, that Emily was simply under stress. The first undeniable sign came one evening at a charity gala, an event they would normally attend together. She had insisted she needed to go alone, something about networking, about making connections that would benefit the gallery. Alexander had let it go, but when he arrived home, a casual glance at their shared calendar caught his eye. There, marked discreetly, was a name: Thomas Lévesque. A name that meant nothing to him at first. The entry simply read, Dinner W/Thomas. It wasn't the name itself that made his stomach tighten, it was the fact that Emily hadn't mentioned it. He did his research. Thomas Lévesque was a rising artist, young, ambitious, known for his abstract expressionist pieces. Talented, certainly, but unpolished. He had the kind of raw potential Emily had always been drawn to. Kingsley Modern had never showcased his work, yet Emily had written his name down as though he were already an integral part of their world. That was when Alexander truly began to pay attention. Days passed and the signs became impossible to ignore. The whispered phone calls in the next room, the way Emily angled her laptop screen away from him when he entered her office, the sudden influx of transfers into the gallery's accounts, money from anonymous investors he had never heard of. One night, he overheard her on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "This is it, Thomas. We're finally making it happen." The words lingered with him long after she had gone to bed. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through possibilities. Was it business? Was it more? He didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, he watched, he listened. He began piecing together fragments of conversations, noting her absences, tracking the way she moved through their shared space with a nervous energy, like a thief waiting to be caught. Then came the moment that shattered any lingering doubt. A bank statement left carelessly on her desk. A large sum of money had been wired into the gallery's account from a private collector in Switzerland, an investor Emily had never mentioned. It wasn't the money itself that alarmed him. It was the way it had been allocated. A significant portion had been funneled into a private account under her name. Alexander felt something inside him shift. Anger, betrayal, a sense of inevitability. This wasn't just infidelity. This was something deeper, something calculated. Emily wasn't just lying to him. She was planning something behind his back, something that involved their business, their legacy. He thought about confronting her, about demanding an explanation, but instinct told him to wait. She thought she was in control. She thought he was oblivious. That was her first mistake. In the days that followed, Alexander observed her with a newfound clarity. He watched her weave her lies with practiced ease, noticed the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when he asked about her schedule. He could almost admire the performance. Almost. But he knew now that she was working against him, not with him. And Thomas, he wasn't just some promising artist. He was the wedge Emily was using to pry open the foundations of everything Alexander had built. Late one night when Emily was out, Alexander walked into her office and opened her laptop. He was no fool. He knew she had passwords, knew she had things locked away, but people grew careless. He checked her emails, the ones she thought she had deleted. There it was, an entire chain of messages between her and Thomas, discussing something called the transition. He clicked through, reading in growing disbelief. Thomas was set to become the face of a new movement, one that Emily was orchestrating. They had buyers lined up. They had a plan to introduce a new collection, one that would change everything. The problem? They intended to use his gallery to do it, without him, without his name attached. He read the words she had written to Thomas. Kingsley doesn't see the vision, but soon it won't matter. The gallery will be yours, and we'll finally be free to create something bigger. He sat there for a long time, staring at the words. His own wife was plotting to take the very thing they had built together and hand it to someone else. She wasn't just betraying him, she was erasing him. Alexander closed the laptop. His hands were steady, his pulse was calm. He had the truth now, but truth wasn't enough. If he wanted to stop them, if he wanted to make them pay, he couldn't simply confront her. That would be foolish, emotional. No, he had spent his life perfecting the art of presentation, of curation, of timing. If she wanted a masterpiece, he would give her one. She thought she had won. That was her second mistake. Alexander had always believed that true art was about patience. The stroke of a brush, the layering of colors, the careful composition of a scene. Nothing was rushed, nothing was accidental. Now he found himself applying the same principle to his revenge. He didn't act immediately. He didn't lash out or demand answers. Instead, he observed, absorbed, and waited. He became the silent curator of his own destruction, cataloging every betrayal with meticulous care. Emily remained blissfully unaware. She still smiled at him over breakfast, still kissed his cheek absent-mindedly before heading off to meetings, still curled up beside him at night with the same routine affection as always. But Alexander no longer saw her as his wife. She was a subject now, an unfinished portrait of deceit. And he was the artist, waiting for the perfect moment to complete the piece. He started collecting evidence, though not in the way a detective might. He didn't need to hire a private investigator or rifle through her belongings like some desperate man clinging to denial. No, he let her reveal everything herself. He had always believed that people, given enough time, would paint their own downfall. So he watched, he listened, he made mental notes. Emily was clever, but she had grown too comfortable in her deception. She didn't realize how often she spoke of Thomas now, how his name slipped into conversations with an ease that betrayed familiarity. Thomas has such a fresh perspective, she'd say, swirling her wine at dinner. He sees art differently, less confined, less rigid. It's what the industry needs. She would glance at Alexander then, as if gauging his reaction. He never gave her one. He simply nodded, offering a knowing smile, allowing her to think he was indifferent. The financial records told a more damning story. He had access to everything, of course. Emily had never considered that he might check. The anonymous investors, the quiet transfers between accounts, the slow siphoning of funds from Kingsley Modern's reserves to an entirely separate entity. A shell company, one she controlled. The name of the entity was almost laughable in its audacity. E.T. Collective, Emily and Thomas. They hadn't even tried to disguise it. That was when Alexander understood the full extent of her plan. She wasn't just leaving him, she was taking everything with her. The gallery, the clients, the reputation they had built together. She was dismantling it piece by piece, constructing something new in its place, something that excluded him entirely. He imagined her vision, saw it as clearly as she must have. A grand unveiling of Tomas's masterpieces, the announcement of a new movement in contemporary art, the strategic shift of power from Kingsley Modern to E.T. Collective, and at the center of it all, she and Thomas would stand together, partners in every sense of the word. Alexander felt the anger settle deep in his chest, but he didn't let it control him. Emotion had no place in this. He wouldn't waste time questioning why she had done it. The betrayal was already complete. Now, it was simply a matter of how best to dismantle her in return. The next step was confirming what he already knew. Confronting her now would be premature. He needed her to feel safe, to believe that nothing had changed, that she was still operating in secrecy. That was why, when he received an invitation to a private art showing in a loft downtown, one hosted by none other than Thomas Levesque, he didn't hesitate. He RSVP'd. The event was exactly what he expected. A collection of carefully curated patrons, journalists, and investors, all eager to witness the rise of the industry's next great prodigy. The loft was dimly lit, the walls lined with Thomas's work, abstract pieces dripping with bold strokes and chaotic energy, each one priced outrageously high. Emily was there, of course. She hadn't noticed him yet, too engrossed in her role as the artist's benefactor, whispering to collectors, guiding them toward the most expensive pieces, weaving the narrative of Thomas's genius with the same effortless charm that had once been reserved for Alexander's gallery. He stood at a distance, watching her work the room, waiting for her to slip. And then it happened. A brief moment, a flicker of truth buried in the performance. She leaned into Thomas, her hand resting lightly against his chest as she whispered something to him, her lips brushing the corner of his jaw in a gesture that was too familiar, too intimate to be anything other than confirmation. Alexander exhaled slowly, steadying himself. There it was, the final brushstroke on the portrait of her betrayal. And now it was his turn to create. Alexander didn't leave immediately. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he stayed, blending into the background, exchanging polite nods with acquaintances, even engaging in small talk with a few collectors who recognized him. He played the part of the disinterested observer, giving Emily no reason to suspect he had seen anything at all. When she finally noticed him across the room, her expression barely flickered. Just a moment of hesitation before she smiled and made her way over, glass of champagne in hand. "A surprise to see you here," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "Is it?" Alexander tilted his head slightly, mirroring her composed tone. "Thomas is a rising star, isn't he? I had to see what all the excitement was about." Emily's smile didn't falter, but he caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way she squared her shoulders just a little too much, as if bracing herself. "I didn't think this was your scene. You've always preferred a more refined approach to exhibitions." He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "I appreciate all forms of art. Besides, you've been talking about Tomas so much lately, I figured it was time I saw his work up close." A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes, but she recovered quickly, taking a sip of her drink. "He's talented, unconventional, but that's what makes him special. People are drawn to authenticity, to raw passion." Alexander nodded, pretending to study one of the paintings on the wall. "Authenticity, passion. Yes, I can see why that would be appealing." His gaze flickered back to her, meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "And I suppose that's why you've been spending so much time with him?" For a fraction of a second she faltered. It was barely noticeable, just the slightest shift in her breath, the faint tightening of her grip around the glass. Then she smiled again, softer this time, tilting her head as if amused. "Alex, Are you jealous?" The way she said it, so casually, so dismissively, sent a cold ripple through him. He returned her smile but didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch between them until she finally exhaled and glanced away. "I should introduce you to some people," she said after a moment, as if eager to change the subject. "There are a few investors here who could be valuable to the gallery." "Ah," Alexander set his glass down on a nearby table. "About that, I've been meaning to ask, who exactly are these new investors, the ones funneling money into Kingsley Modern?" That did it. The smile flickered, a barely perceptible hesitation. "Just some interested parties," she said lightly. "People who believe in the future of the gallery. And yet, I don't seem to have met any of them," Alexander mused. "Strange, considering I'm the owner." Emily laughed, but it was thinner now, more forced. "You've been so busy. I didn't want to overwhelm you with the details. You trust me, don't you?" That was the moment he realized just how deeply she believed in her own performance. She truly thought she was still in control, that she could weave the same effortless fabric of half-truths and misdirections she had always relied on. Alexander smiled, but this time it wasn't polite. It wasn't reassuring. It was something sharper, something deliberate. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I trust you completely." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, unaware that the stage she had built so carefully was already beginning to collapse beneath her. Alexander had always known that revenge, like art, required patience. He couldn't afford to act impulsively, couldn't allow raw emotion to dictate his next move. Emily believed she had already won, that she had outmaneuvered him, that he was nothing more than an obstacle she had carefully sidestepped on her way to something greater. Let her believe that. Let her bask in her illusion of control, because soon the world she had built on lies and stolen ambition would come crashing down around her. He spent the following weeks laying the groundwork. Every detail had to be perfect. The deception had to feel seamless. He worked quietly, discreetly, never raising suspicion. The first step was ensuring that Kingsley Modern remained legally untouchable. With the help of a well-connected attorney, he quietly restructured the gallery's ownership, placing its most valuable assets under a separate trust, one Emily had no access to. The financial transfers she had orchestrated, he reversed them before she even realized, siphoning the funds back into accounts only he controlled. She believed she was securing her future, but in reality, she was investing in an empire that no longer belonged to her. Then came the exhibition. The grand unveiling, the moment she had been waiting for. Emily and Thomas had spent months preparing for this, their triumph, their declaration to the art world that they were visionaries, unbound by tradition. Kingsley Modern was hosting it, of course. Emily had insisted, spinning some story about continuity, about passing the torch, about evolution. She had no idea that Alexander had been waiting for this moment, carefully ensuring that all the right people would be there. Investors, critics, collectors, people whose opinions shaped reputations, whose words could make or break careers. The night of the exhibition arrived, and the gallery buzzed with anticipation. Alexander moved through the crowd effortlessly, greeting guests, playing the part of the gracious host. He could feel the energy in the air, the sense of something monumental about to unfold. Emily, radiant in a sleek black gown, floated through the space like a queen surveying her kingdom. Thomas stood beside her, basking in the attention, the excitement, the whispered admiration of those who had already deemed him the next great master. Alexander let them have their moment, let them believe they were on the verge of something historic. Then, as the lights dimmed and the crowd hushed in anticipation, he stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the space with practiced ease, "thank you all for being here tonight. This exhibition represents not just a collection of extraordinary work, but a turning point in contemporary art. A moment that challenges everything we believe about authenticity, about value, about the very foundation of artistic integrity." Emily smiled from across the room, pride evident in her expression. She thought he was giving them his blessing. She had no idea that the noose was tightening. Alexander gestured toward the largest piece in the gallery, Thomas's supposed magnum opus. "This painting," he continued, "is the culmination of countless hours of effort, of vision, of creative genius. Or so we were led to believe." A ripple of confusion passed through the audience. Emily's smile faltered. "You see, what makes art valuable is not simply the image on the canvas, but the story behind it. The authenticity, the belief that what we see is the raw, unfiltered truth of the artist's soul." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But what if that belief was a lie? A murmur spread through the crowd. "In preparation for this evening, I conducted a little research," Alexander said, his tone almost casual. "I wanted to understand what made these pieces so extraordinary, and what I found was fascinating." He turned toward the projection screen that had been set up for the event. A click, and the first image appeared. An older painting, one from a renowned but deceased artist whose work had been showcased at Kingsley Modern years ago. Then, another click and an overlay of Thomas's original piece appeared beside it. The similarities were undeniable. The brushstrokes, the composition, even the color palette. A hush fell over the room. "Not just one," Alexander said, clicking through more images. "Not just a coincidence, but a pattern. A deliberate replication. A forgery passed off as innovation." Emily had gone pale. Thomas stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if struggling to comprehend what was happening. "The investors who supported this collection," Alexander continued, "believed they were funding the future of art. They were promised exclusivity, authenticity. Instead, they were sold imitations." A man in the front row, one of the evening's biggest investors, turned toward Emily with an expression of disbelief. "Is this true?" he demanded. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. "It gets worse," Alexander said, stepping down from the stage, moving slowly through the stunned crowd. "Because this isn't just about forgery. It's about fraud, financial manipulation, a scheme to transfer wealth from this gallery, my gallery, into a separate entity controlled by two individuals who had no legal right to it." He stopped in front of Emily and Thomas, his expression unreadable. "Would you like to explain that part, Emily, or should I?" She shook her head slightly, eyes darting toward the exits, toward the watching faces, toward Thomas, who was already inching away from her, as if putting distance between them would somehow spare him. Alexander sighed, as if disappointed. "No answer? That's unfortunate, because I do have answers. Bank statements, contracts, emails, documents confirming every step of your plan." He looked at Thomas then, tilting his head slightly. "Did she tell you she put everything in your name, that legally you're the one responsible for the misappropriated funds?" Thomas blinked. "What?" Emily let out a strangled sound. "No, he's lying, Thomas, don't." But Thomas wasn't listening. He was staring at Alexander, at the growing horror in Emily's eyes, at the investors who were already murmuring about legal repercussions, about criminal charges. And then, like a true coward, he did exactly what Alexander had predicted. He ran. Thomas shoved past a stunned group of guests, his breath shallow, his eyes darting toward the nearest exit. He had come here expecting a coronation, a night where he would be celebrated, where he would step out from Alexander's shadow and into the limelight. Instead, he was running like a trapped animal, every eye in the room following his frantic retreat. The doors slammed behind him, leaving only the stunned silence of the crowd and the weight of what had just unfolded. Emily was still standing there, frozen in place, her face drained of color. She turned to Alexander, eyes flashing with desperation, as if there was still some way to salvage this. "Alex," she started, voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't what you think. This is all a misunderstanding." He let her speak, let the words spill out, because he wanted her to believe just for a moment that she had a chance. He had spent weeks waiting for this night, watching her construct her illusions, weaving her falsehoods with the same precision as a master forger. He wasn't about to take that from her too quickly. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed, tilting his head as if considering it. "Emily, did I misunderstand the financial records, the private accounts? The money siphoned from Kingsley Modern into ET Collective? Did I misunderstand your emails to Thomas, outlining how you would ensure I was left with nothing? He took a slow step toward her, lowering his voice. Did I misunderstand when you called me an obstacle? A relic of the past? When you told him that soon the gallery would be his? Emily's mouth opened, but no sound came. She had nothing left to say, and she knew it. Behind them, the murmur of the guests grew louder, investors whispering to one another, collectors checking their phones for updates, journalists furiously typing, realizing they had stumbled onto something far more valuable than an art exhibition. You think you can do this? She finally snapped, her voice sharpening as fear gave way to anger. You think you can just embarrass me in front of everyone? You think this will destroy me? I built this gallery with you. I made it what it is. People respect me. They trust me. Alexander smiled then, slow and deliberate. No, Emily, he said softly. They did, but not anymore. The words landed like a death sentence. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored suit, stepped forward. Is it true? She demanded. The forgeries? The money? Emily swallowed hard. It's true, Alexander answered for her. The evidence is in the files I sent to all of you just before this event started. You might want to check your emails. A few guests pulled out their phones. The investor did the same. Within seconds, her expression hardened. This is fraud, she said coldly. This is career-ending. Do you realize the legal implications of this? Emily turned back to Alexander, her eyes wide, pleading. You don't have to do this. We can fix this. You don't have to ruin me. He exhaled, as if considering it. That's where you're wrong. I do. And I already have. She stood there, trembling, and for the first time that night, he saw it. The realization that she had lost. That everything she had built on deception, on manipulation, on betrayal, had collapsed in a single evening. Then, the whispers turned into movement. Collectors began filing out, murmuring among themselves, shaking their heads. Investors looked at Emily like she was nothing more than a failed investment. The journalists didn't leave, of course. They stayed, taking notes, capturing every detail. Tomorrow, this scandal would be everywhere. Emily looked around wildly, as if searching for someone to take her side, but Thomas was gone. The investors had turned their backs. The guests were leaving. And Alexander? He stood still, watching the masterpiece of her destruction unfold. Emily had always believed in reinvention. It was what had made her so dangerous, so successful, so convincing. She could take any failure, any mistake, and twist it into a narrative that suited her needs. She had spent years perfecting the art of persuasion, of charm, of knowing exactly how to make people see her the way she wanted to be seen. But tonight, as she stood alone in the remnants of her downfall, there was no one left to convince, no narrative left to craft, no more masks to wear. The guests had left in a slow, deliberate wave, their murmurs still lingering in the air like the fading echoes of a symphony. The investors, once eager to be aligned with her, had turned their backs first. The collectors followed, their admiration curdling into suspicion. The journalists, always hungry for a scandal, remained the longest, ensuring that every detail was captured, every disgrace immortalized. By morning, her name would be in every major art publication, not as a visionary, not as the brilliant mind behind Kingsley Modern, but as a fraud, a liar, a woman who had gambled everything and lost. She turned to Alexander, desperation flickering behind her eyes, but he saw the fight in her still, the stubborn refusal to accept that this was the end. This isn't over, she said, her voice quiet but edged with defiance. You think you've won, but people forget. Scandals fade. I can rebuild. I can fix this. He studied her for a moment, as if considering the possibility. He almost admired her resilience, the way she still believed, even in the face of undeniable truth, that she could claw her way out. He took a slow step closer, his voice low, meant only for her. You don't understand, do you? This wasn't just about ruining you. This was about ensuring you never rise again. You didn't just commit fraud, Emily. You stole. You misrepresented assets. You defrauded investors, and I made sure every single piece of evidence is in the hands of people who will make sure you answer for it." Her breath caught, her hands clenching at her sides as she processed what he was saying. "No," she whispered. "You always thought you were the smartest person in the room, that people would forgive you, that you'd talk your way out of it, that you'd find another investor, another gallery, another opportunity." He tilted his head, watching as understanding finally dawned in her eyes. But this time, there's no one left to fool. For the first time that night, she looked truly afraid. And then, just as quickly, the fear was replaced by something else. She let out a quiet, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "And what about you?" she said, straightening her shoulders, as if reclaiming what little power she had left. "You think you'll walk away from this untouched? You think people won't talk about how you let this happen under your nose? You were supposed to be the great Alexander Kingsley, the master of the modern art world, and yet you were blind to what was happening in your own gallery. Do you really believe you've won?" Alexander exhaled slowly, as if considering her words. Then he smiled. "I don't need to win," he said. "I just needed you to lose." And with that, he turned and walked away. The days that followed played out exactly as he had planned. The scandal spread like wildfire, dominating every conversation in the art world. Emily's reputation was destroyed beyond repair. Galleries distanced themselves, investors pulled out, and by the end of the week, formal charges were filed against her. The lawsuits piled up, and soon it became clear there was no rebuilding from this. There was no comeback story waiting for her. As for Thomas, he had been caught trying to flee the country, his accounts already frozen by the authorities. In his desperation, he tried to blame Emily for everything, claiming he had been manipulated, that he had no idea about the forgeries, that he had simply followed orders. No one believed him. His career was over before it had even truly begun. Alexander watched it all unfold from a distance, never once interfering, never once gloating. He didn't need to. The world had already decided their fate for them. Kingsley Modern, despite the scandal, survived. More than that, it thrived. Collectors who had once been wary now saw Alexander as a force of integrity, a man who had exposed corruption rather than been consumed by it. He rebranded, reshaped the gallery's future, and by the time the dust settled, he stood stronger than ever. One evening, weeks after it all ended, he stood alone in the gallery, sipping a glass of wine as he surveyed the space. The walls were empty for now, waiting for the next great collection, the next masterpiece to take its place. Emily had once called him an obstacle, something in the way of progress. She had underestimated him. She had forgotten that art, like revenge, was about patience, about precision, about the perfect execution. And tonight, as he stood in the gallery that was still his, stronger than before, he realized the truth. She had been his greatest creation, his finest masterpiece, a portrait of betrayal, framed in ruin, displayed for the world to see.